In the aftermath of the dinosaurs' disappearance, Earth enters a quieter but profoundly transformative age. The Paleogene period unfolds as a time of recovery and experimentation where shattered ecosystems slowly rebuild. Mammals, once small and overlooked, begin to diversify in size, form, and behavior, spreading across land, sea, and sky. Forests expand, climates shift, and new food webs take shape, setting the foundations of the modern world. If you enjoy calm journeys through deep time and ancient change, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. In the earliest Paleogene period, roughly beginning 66 million years ago, Earth is still marked by the recent mass extinction that ended the Cretaceous period and the long age of non-avian dinosaurs. A thin layer rich in impact-related material lies within many rock sequences, and above it the sediments of the Paleogene preserve a world that adjusts slowly to new conditions. In ocean cores, river deposits, and ancient lake beds, the record shows that the violent phase of the impact has passed. The dust and aerosols in the atmosphere have begun to settle, and sunlight reaches the surface more reliably again. The climate system, however, does not simply return to its earlier state. Greenhouse gases from fires, decomposing biomass, and long-term volcanic activity raise atmospheric carbon dioxide, and global temperatures remain high by modern standards. The Paleogene is the first period of the Cenozoic era, and ultimately spans from about 66 to about 23 million years ago. It is further divided into the Paleocene, Eocene, and Oligocene epochs, each with distinctive climates and faunas. In this first interval, often called the early Paleocene, the focus is on survival and gradual recovery. In the air, small to medium-sized birds are the most visible vertebrate flyers because pterosaurs have disappeared. Some birds occupy coastal margins, others move through inland forests that are beginning to regrow, and some groups already show strong specialization for life on the ground or in trees. In contrast, the skies of the earlier Cretaceous, once shared with large pterosaurs, are no longer dominated by giant reptilian wings. On land, open areas near the impact region had once been stripped of vegetation by intense heat and shock waves, but as the years and centuries pass, plants reclaim the ground. Spores and pollen preserved in sediments show short-lived dominance of fast-colonizing ferns, and other hardy plants followed by a renewed spread of flowering plants and conifers. In many regions, especially at low and middle latitudes, dense forests develop with multi-layered canopies and shaded understories. High atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and warm temperatures favour rapid plant growth and thick, humid woodlands. The soils beneath these forests form new profiles as roots. Fungi and invertebrates mix ash, clay, and organic matter. Rivers that meander through these landscapes carry fine sediment and plant debris toward deltas and shallow seas, storing the physical evidence of these habitats grain by grain. The absence of large non-avian dinosaurs is one of the most striking features of this new age. Before the boundary event, large herbivorous and carnivorous dinosaurs of many families occupied most mid to large body-sized niches on land. Along coasts and in the open oceans, giant marine reptiles such as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs hunted fish and other prey, and large pterosaurs glided above shorelines. After the extinction, these groups are no longer present in the fossil record. The remaining reptiles include crocodilians, turtles, lizards, and snakes, many of which continue along their evolutionary paths with modified diets and behaviours, but they do not occupy all the roles left open by the vanished giants. Crocodilians inhabit rivers, lakes, and coastal wetlands, sometimes reaching large sizes, but their ecological roles are constrained to ambush predation and scavenging along water margins. Turtles and tortoises feed on plants or small animals, and lizards and snakes exploit insects, small vertebrates, and other available prey. In the oceans, the initial aftermath of the impact had caused stress to many plankton groups and shelled organisms because of altered chemistry and reduced photosynthesis. As the early Paleogene proceeds, microscopic plankton communities recover, diversify, and rebuild the base of the marine food webs. These plankton, including calcareous and siliceous forms, draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and contribute to carbon burial as they sink and become part of seafloor sediments. Fish sharks and invertebrates make use of this renewed productivity, and many lineages that had survived the extinction begin to increase again in abundance and distribution. The giant marine reptiles do not return, so large predatory roles in open water become available over geological timescales for other groups to fill. The seawater itself remains warm to considerable depths, especially in low-latitude regions, and global circulation patterns are shaped by the arrangement of continents that continues to differ from today's configuration. On land, the small mammals that survived the extinction begin to play a larger role in ecosystems. During the late Cretaceous, most mammals were small, often roughly comparable in size to modern rodents, and many appear to have been nocturnal and insectivorous or omnivorous. Their fossils are often isolated teeth and jaw fragments, which record sharp cusps and complex chewing surfaces suited to processing insects, small vertebrates, seeds, and plant matter. In the earliest Paleogene, these generalist mammals continue to occupy such roles, but now operate in environments where many former competitors and predators are gone. As forests recover, mammals move through leaf litter burrow in softer soils and climb among low branches. Some lineages begin to explore slightly different diets, incorporating more fruit seeds or soft vegetation. Over millions of years, this flexibility will permit a wide expansion in body size and lifestyle, but at this stage the fossil record still shows primarily small forms that fit into the fine-scale structure of the recovering ecosystems. The early Paleogene atmospheric conditions influenced daily and seasonal patterns in these new communities. High temperatures and, in many regions, high humidity encouraged strong rainfall, supporting evergreen or seasonally lush forests. Polar and high-latitude regions, while cooler, are still much warmer than they are in later periods, allowing forests to grow at far higher latitudes than in modern times. The contrast between equatorial and polar temperatures is relatively modest, which affects wind patterns and ocean currents, and thus the distribution of climates around the globe. These broad patterns of temperature and moisture determine where particular plant types gain a foothold and where animal communities can persist. As plants, invertebrates, reptiles, birds, and mammals interact in these settings, food webs with new combinations of species emerge. Scavengers and decomposers process the remains of organisms that do not survive cycling nutrients back into the soil and water, and each generation of plants and animals leaves its trace in the sedimentary record. The earliest Paleogene world is therefore a scene of ongoing recovery rather than sudden replacement. Its calm, humid forests, warm seas, and altered skies define the environmental context in which subsequent Paleogene evolution proceeds, all built upon the physical and biological consequences of the great extinction that marks the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. In the early Paleogene, the atmosphere and oceans together form the broad environmental frame within which life continues its recovery. High amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the air keep global temperatures elevated compared with modern values, and the surface of the planet does not cool evenly. At low latitudes, shallow seas and tropical land areas remain very warm, while even high latitudes that will later become cold show evidence of relatively mild conditions. In sediments and fossils, this pattern appears in the distribution of temperature-sensitive organisms and in the chemistry of minerals that record the conditions present when they formed. These lines of evidence indicate that the early Paleogene climate is greenhouse-dominated, with small temperature differences between equator and poles and a generally humid atmosphere. The air itself carries more water vapor than in a cooler world, because warm air can hold more moisture, and this increased moisture supports frequent rain in many regions. Large-scale wind patterns continue to circulate heat and moisture around the globe. Near the equator, rising warm air creates belts of low pressure that encourage cloud formation and heavy rainfall. At higher latitudes, air that has lost some of its moisture descends and then moves back toward lower latitudes near the surface. This pattern, repeated in several broad cells in each hemisphere, helps distribute heat from the tropics toward the poles. In a greenhouse-dominated Paleogene climate, the contrast in temperature between warm and cool regions is smaller than it is in later icehouse conditions, and this difference influences the strength and position of storm tracks and atmospheric jets. The result is a world where storms, rainfall, and seasonal shifts are present, but the gradients that drive them are less extreme than those of cooler later periods. Volcanic activity and long-term geologic processes also contribute gases to the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and other volcanic emissions enter the air from eruptions and from slow degassing along mid-ocean ridges. Over geological time, these inputs are balanced by processes that remove carbon from the atmosphere, including the weathering of rocks on land and the burial of carbon-rich sediments in the oceans. In the early Paleogene, this balance is still adjusting after the disturbance of the mass extinction. Warm temperatures speed some chemical reactions involved in weathering, and abundant rainfall helps carry dissolved ions from land into rivers and seas. These processes gradually influence the chemistry of the oceans, and through feedbacks the composition of the atmosphere. The oceans during the early Paleogene are warm from surface to considerable depths, especially in low to middle latitude regions. The temperature structure of the water column affects how easily surface and deep waters mix. When surface waters are significantly warmer and therefore less dense than deeper layers, mixing can be reduced and distinct water masses can develop. Evidence from the shells of microscopic marine organisms preserved in deep sea sediments shows that the difference in temperature between surface and deep waters is sometimes smaller than in modern oceans, suggesting relatively well-mixed warm conditions, while at other times differences increase, indicating periods of stronger stratification. The arrangement of continents also shapes the circulation of the oceans. During the early Paleogene, large ocean basins such as the ancestral Atlantic and the remnant of the Tethys Sea connect different regions of the globe. The positions of these basins and the shallower seaways between them control how currents flow and how heat is transported. In warm greenhouse conditions, strong poleward flowing surface currents can carry heat to higher latitudes, helping to maintain mild climates there. Deep water formation, where surface waters sink to depth, depends on both temperature and salinity. In some high-latitude seas, cold and relatively salty water may still sink and spread along the ocean floor, setting up slow-moving deep currents that circulate over thousands of years. The chemistry of the oceans reflects this interaction between atmosphere water and rock. As carbon dioxide dissolves from the air into seawater, it forms weak acids that react with dissolved ions and with the shells of marine organisms made of calcium carbonate. When the supply of carbon dioxide to the oceans is high, seawater can become more acidic, and the depth at which calcium carbonate dissolves faster than it accumulates, known as the carbonate compensation depth, can become shallower. After the end Cretaceous extinction, there are intervals in the early Paleogene record that suggest stressed conditions for some calcareous plankton, but over time many groups recover and diversify again, rebuilding carbonate-rich sediments on the seafloor. Siliceous plankton, which build their shells from silica rather than carbonate, respond to changes in nutrient supply and water temperature, and their remains add another component to marine sediments. Surface ocean productivity depends on the availability of light and nutrients. In the early Paleogene, high temperatures and stratified warm waters in low-latitude regions can limit the upward mixing of nutrient-rich deep water, reducing productivity in some open ocean areas. In contrast, regions where winds, currents, or upwelling bring deeper water toward the surface can support richer plankton blooms. Coastal upwelling zones and certain boundary currents may therefore act as centers of biological activity, where microscopic algae grow in large numbers support zooplankton, and in turn feed fish and larger predators. These patterns of productivity influence how much organic carbon sinks to the deep ocean and becomes buried in sediments, which over geological time contributes to the long-term regulation of atmospheric carbon dioxide. At the sea surface, the interface between ocean and atmosphere is a continuous site of exchange. Heat moves from warm air into cooler water, or from warm water into cooler air depending on local conditions, and water evaporates from the ocean into the atmosphere carrying latent heat that is released when it later condenses to form clouds and rain. Gases including carbon dioxide and oxygen move across this boundary by diffusion with their fluxes controlled by differences in concentration and by turbulence from waves and winds. In the early Paleogene, these exchanges help smooth out regional differences in temperature and composition, linking distant parts of the climate system. The polar regions of the early Paleogene illustrate how different this greenhouse world is from later times. Fossil plants and animals found at high latitude sites indicate the presence of forests and temperate to warm conditions, where today there is seasonal or permanent sea ice. The lack of large continental ice sheets means that sea level is higher than in modern times, flooding low-lying coastal areas and creating broad, shallow epicontinental seas in some regions. These shallow seas store heat, host diverse marine communities, and serve as pathways for the movement of water masses and organisms between larger basins. Their presence modifies local climate, often making nearby land areas milder and wetter than they would be if those regions were exposed land. Over the span of the Paleogene, the climate does not remain fixed. Shorter-lived events and longer trends both leave their marks in the geological record. Within the early Paleogene, there are rapid warming events superimposed on the already warm background, when additional carbon enters the atmosphere and oceans over relatively short geological intervals. These events, recorded by changes in stable isotopes in marine and terrestrial sediments, provide further evidence of how closely linked the air and seas are. When carbon levels rise, temperatures increase in both, and organisms must adjust by shifting their ranges, adapting or declining. Although the details of each event differ together, they illustrate the sensitivity of the coupled atmosphere-ocean system during a greenhouse interval. In the early Paleogene, therefore, the atmosphere and oceans operate as an integrated whole. Warm air rich in water vapor, high carbon dioxide levels, and broadly warm seas create a climate state that differs in important ways from later cooler periods. Winds and currents carry heat toward the poles, shallow seas flood continental margins, and chemical exchanges between rock, water, and air gradually reshape the composition of all three. Within this setting, ecosystems recover and reorganize, but the basic physical and chemical conditions of the air and sea form the outermost layer of the story, setting the boundaries within which later Paleogene landscapes, plants and animals develop. On the continents during the Paleogene, plants and soils rebuild the basic structure of landscapes that were damaged by the end Cretaceous extinction. At first, in many places close to the impact horizon, there is a marked rise in fern spores in the fossil record, a signal that hardy pioneer plants move quickly into disturbed ground. Ferns tolerate poor soils and high light levels, and they spread by spores that travel easily on wind and water. As time passes and conditions stabilize, this early phase gives way to a more complex vegetation cover. Flowering plants, which had already diversified before the extinction, expand again and form the backbone of many Paleogene forests. They share the land with conifers, cycads, and other seed plants, but flowering trees, shrubs, and herbs increasingly dominate many low and mid-latitude communities. Evidence for this comes from fossil leaves, seeds, fruits, and especially pollen grains preserved in river lake and coastal deposits. Pollen grains have resistant walls that survive long after the parent plant decays, and their shapes and surface patterns allow identification of broad plant groups. By counting and comparing these grains through layers of sediment, paleobotanists reconstruct how plant communities change with time in different regions. In early Paleocene intervals, many low-latitude areas show pollen assemblages dominated by broadleaf evergreen trees and related plants that prefer warm, humid conditions. The presence of such pollen at higher latitudes than expected in a cooler world supports the conclusion that the Paleogene climate is warm and greenhouse-dominated. Forests during this time often form closed canopies with tall trees, intercepting most of the sunlight and creating shaded understories. Beneath the canopy, younger trees, shrubs, ferns, and ground-level herbs occupy small gaps where light reaches the floor. Vines and lianas climb trunks and branches using the structure of the forest to reach better lit zones. These layers create a three-dimensional environment that provides varied habitats for insects, birds, and small mammals, even though those animals are not yet the main focus. The soils under these forests develop through interactions among weathering rock plant roots, fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. Warm temperatures and ample moisture make chemical weathering efficient. Minerals in bedrock break down, releasing nutrients such as calcium, potassium, and phosphorus. Fine particles form clays and silts, while organic matter from fallen leaves, branches, and dead roots accumulates in the upper layers. Decomposers break down this material, returning nutrients to forms that plants can use. In some places, especially in low-lying wet areas, the accumulation of plant material outpaces decomposition, leading to the formation of thick peat layers that can later become coal seams. These peat and coal deposits record long periods of high plant productivity and waterlogged conditions where oxygen is limited. Across the Paleogene, the distribution of these dense forests is not uniform. Near the equator, wet tropical forests occupy broad lowlands and foothills. At middle latitudes, warm temperate forests with both evergreen and deciduous species extend across continents that are positioned differently from those of the present day. Even polar regions support forests during much of the Paleogene composed of species adapted to long seasonal light cycles, but not to deep freezing. Fossil wood and leaves from high-latitude sites show growth rings and anatomical features that record these unusual conditions. Instead of prolonged winter darkness combined with intense cold, many high-latitude Paleogene forests experience mild temperatures with long periods of low-angle light or twilight. This setting supports plant communities that differ from those of both modern polar regions and modern temperate zones. Within this broad pattern, local and regional differences arise from topography and geology. Uplifted mountain belts, volcanic arcs, and high plateaus create gradients in temperature and rainfall over relatively short distances. On windward slopes, moist air masses rise cool and release rain-feeding cloud forests and dense vegetation. On leeward slopes, descending air becomes drier and warms, favouring more open woodlands or seasonal forests. River systems carry water sediment and nutrients from uplands to lowlands, connecting these various plant communities. Along riverbanks and floodplains, gallery forests and riparian woodlands track the shifting channels, while seasonal floods leave behind layers of silt and sand that renew soils. Over millions of years, the balance between closed forests and more open vegetation shifts. In the early Paleogene, dense forests dominate many regions, but there are also wetlands, coastal swamps, and more open woodland patches, especially in drier interiors. Through the Eocene, high global temperatures and elevated carbon dioxide continue to support extensive warm forests. Plant fossils from this time often show leaves with smooth margins and large sizes, traits associated with warm and humid climates. The presence of palms and other warmth-loving taxa at high latitudes further confirms the greenhouse state. Toward the later Paleogene, especially in the Oligocene long-term cooling trends, begin to influence vegetation. While this lies somewhat inward in time compared with the warm early phases, it is still part of the same plant-centered story. Cooling and changes in rainfall patterns lead to a gradual contraction of some tropical and subtropical forests in certain regions, with increased development of more open woodland shrublands and the earliest, more continuous grass-dominated areas. Grasses themselves already exist earlier in the Paleogene, but they do not yet form widespread open grasslands of the kind seen in much later periods. Instead, they occupy specific habitats such as lake margins, disturbed ground, and patches within forest clearings. As climates cool and become more seasonal, grasses gain more space in some areas, but closed canopy forests continue to dominate large parts of the tropics and many mid-latitude zones. This structure and composition of Paleogene vegetation also reflect the interactions between plants and herbivores, although in this section, the focus remains on the plants and soils themselves. Leaves show traces of feeding by insects, including whole skeletonized areas and mined tissues, all of which can be preserved in fossil form. Some leaves bear galls, which are growths induced by insects or other organisms. By studying these traces, researchers examine how insect communities respond to changing plant assemblages and climates across the Paleogene. In some intervals, there are increases in the diversity and intensity of insect damage, suggesting that warming events or other shifts create conditions favourable to particular groups of herbivores. Tree trunks and roots also show symbiosis with fungi, such as mycorrhizal associations that improve nutrient uptake. These relationships are harder to observe directly in fossils, but can sometimes be inferred from microscopic structures in fossilized roots and from isotopic signatures in plant tissues. In wetlands and coastal lowlands, mangrove-like communities and swamp forests occupy zones that are frequently flooded. Here, trees and shrubs develop specialized root systems that cope with low oxygen levels and unstable substrates. These environments store large amounts of organic carbon in waterlogged soils. During the Paleogene, high sea levels and broad shallow shelves create many such coastal wetlands, especially along the margins of warm epicontinental seas. The plants that live there help stabilize sediments and influence coastal geomorphology. Over longer timescales, changes in sea level sediment supply and tectonic uplift shift the positions of these wetlands, leaving behind stacked sequences of plant-rich layers and more mineral-rich deposits in the geological record. The continuous exchange of carbon between vegetation soils and the atmosphere is an important part of the Paleogene system. Plants draw carbon dioxide from the air through photosynthesis and store it in their tissues. When they die, some of this carbon returns quickly to the atmosphere through decay, while some becomes part of soils or is buried in sediments. Over millions of years, the rates of plant growth, decomposition, erosion, and burial all influence the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and oceans. In a warm Paleogene greenhouse world, high plant productivity and extensive forests contribute to this cycle, but the balance between sources and sinks still determines whether carbon dioxide levels remain high-rise further or begin to fall. Chemical weathering of silicate rocks enhanced by tree roots and soil acids provides a long-term sink for carbon dioxide by forming bicarbonate ions that eventually precipitate as carbonate minerals in the oceans. This coupling between vegetation and climate means that Paleogene forests and soils are not just passive responders to climate. They also participate in the slow feedbacks that help guide the climate toward later states. In summary, the Paleogene continents support a rich and changing cover of plants that rebuilds after the extinction and adapts to greenhouse conditions. from fern-dominated early recovery surfaces to complex tropical and temperate forests, and later to more mixed mosaics that include open woodlands and grass patches. Vegetation shapes the physical character of the land. Soils, rivers, wetlands, and coastal swamps link these plant communities together and mediate the flow of water nutrients and carbon. Within these layered forests and varied plant communities, the stage is set for animals to diversify and explore new roles. But within this section, the focus remains on the green framework itself, which provides the living background for all later Paleogene evolution on land. In the Paleogene landscapes already reshaped by changing climate, recovering forests and warm seas, small generalist mammals gradually become a constant presence in almost every terrestrial habitat. In the late Cretaceous, mammals exist mostly in the shadows of dinosaurs, many of them confined to small body sizes with lifestyles built around nocturnal activity, insect feeding, and cautious movements under vegetation or within burrows. After the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, these survivors and their descendants find a world where many mid to large-sized vertebrate roles are empty. The shift is not sudden, because climate, vegetation and food webs all need time to stabilize, but over millions of years the fossil record reveals a steady increase in the number, diversity and ecological roles of small mammals. In early Paleogene sediments, especially those of the Paleocene, the remains of these animals are often tiny teeth, jaw fragments, and occasional more complete skeletons preserved in river deposits, lake beds and ancient floodplains. Teeth provide a particularly clear window into their way of life. Mammalian teeth, unlike those of many reptiles, are often highly differentiated along the jaw and are replaced only once or not at all after a certain age. This means that their shapes must serve the animal for much of its life, and natural selection shapes those forms to match diet. Under magnification, Paleogene mammal teeth show combinations of sharp cusps, cutting crests and flatter basins that indicate omnivorous and insectivorous feeding. Some teeth have high-pointed cusps that slice through insects and small vertebrates. Others have broader lower cusps that crush seeds, fruits, and softer plant matter. Many early Paleogene mammals combine these features, a pattern consistent with generalist diets that can shift as local food sources change. Body size in these early generalist mammals usually remains modest. Many species fall in ranges comparable to modern rodents or small carnivores, with masses from a few tens of grams up to perhaps a few kilograms. A small body warms and cools quickly, which can be a challenge, but it also allows access to microhabitats within leaf litter, under logs and inside narrow burrows. Skeletons of Paleogene mammals show limb proportions and joint structures that fit different modes of movement. Some have short, robust limbs and strongly clawed hands, and feet suited for digging and scratching in soil or rotting wood. Others have more slender limbs and flexible joints that suggest agility in climbing or rapid running along the ground. In some cases, elongated hind limbs hint at hopping or bounding gaits, while elongated tails provide balance. These differences mean that even while body sizes remain small, mammals already partition the physical space of forests and woodlands into many fine-scale niches. For example, some small forms probably spend much of their time on or near the forest floor, moving through litter and low vegetation, feeding on insects, fallen fruits and seeds. Their hearing and smell are likely well developed, helping them detect both food and predators in cluttered environments where visibility is limited. Others may climb shrubs and trees using claws and flexible ankles to grip bark and branches, and feed on insects among leaves or on fruits held above the ground. Still others may adopt semi-fossorial habits, digging burrows where they rest during parts of the day and where they can shelter during extremes of temperature or periods of high predation risk. The warm, humid Paleogene climate benefits these small mammals by supporting abundant invertebrates and plant growth. Insects and other arthropods, including beetles, ants, termites, and many others, find rich resources in decomposing woodleaf litter and living plants. This in turn provides a steady food source for insect-eating mammals. Fruit-bearing plants and seed-producing trees and shrubs offer energy-rich plant foods. In such settings, a generalist diet that includes both animal and plant material is especially useful. If one food type becomes less available due to seasonal changes or local disturbance, a generalist mammal can shift its feeding toward other available items. This flexibility helps stabilize populations over long periods and supports the persistence of many lineages through climatic fluctuations and local habitat changes within the overall greenhouse framework. Reproduction and life history traits also contribute to the success of small generalist mammals, although these features are inferred indirectly. In general, small mammals today tend to have shorter lifespans, earlier maturation, and more frequent reproduction than larger mammals. Paleogene small mammals likely share similar patterns with multiple offspring per year in some species and relatively short intervals between generations. This allows natural selection to act rapidly on genetic variation, promoting adaptation to new diets, predators, and microhabitats. It also means that populations can recover more quickly from local disturbances such as floods, fires, or disease outbreaks, as long as some individuals survive and suitable habitat remains nearby. The geographic distribution of these mammals broadens as they diversify. In the early Paleogene continents are positioned such that land connections exist between some regions that are separated today or are organized differently. Relatively warm climates at high latitudes combined with land bridges and shallow seaways permit exchanges of mammal groups between continents. Fossil localities across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, as well as developing records from other regions, show related families of small mammals present in distant areas, indicating dispersal over large scales. At the same time, isolation in some basins or on emerging islands may promote local differentiation as populations adapt to specific sets of plants, predators, and competitors. Analyses of fossil assemblages from different parts of the world reveal both shared families and regionally distinct lineages, reflecting a balance between dispersal and local evolution. Sensory adaptations are another important component of Paleogene mammal success. The internal structures of skulls, such as the shape of the brain case and the size of regions associated with smell and hearing, are not always preserved in detail, but overall cranial forms suggest that many small mammals rely heavily on olfaction and audition. Enlarged nasal regions and complex turbinate bones where present increased surface area for detecting airborne molecules. Middle ear bones derived from jaw elements of more distant ancestors allow sensitive hearing of higher frequency sounds useful for detecting the movements and calls of other animals under forest cover. Eyes differ in size and orientation between taxa, hinting at combinations of nocturnal, crepuscular, and diurnal activity patterns. Together, these sensory capacities help small mammals navigate complex environments where much of the relevant information arrives as sound and scent rather than clear visual cues. Interactions with other vertebrates also shape the roles of these generalist mammals. Crocodilians, large birds, snakes, and some larger mammals all act as potential predators, especially along river margins, wetlands, and open patches. In response, small mammals adopt behaviors and body forms that reduce risk, such as living in groups using burrows or relying on agility and speed. Some may be preyed upon by newly evolving mammalian carnivores, but in the early Paleogene these larger predators are still less diverse and less dominant than they will become later on. At the same time, small mammals also act as predators themselves on insects, small reptiles and smaller mammals, and as seed dispersers and fruit consumers for many plants. By eating fruits and passing seeds through their digestive systems, or by carrying seeds in their fur and hordes, they assist the spread of certain plant species across the landscape. Over the tens of millions of years that make up the Paleogene, the balance between generalist and specialist mammals shifts gradually, but for a long interval, generalists remain prominent. Some lineages begin to specialize more on particular diets, such as hard seeds, tough leaves, or aquatic invertebrates, and their teeth and skeletons reflect these narrower roles. Others stay broadly omnivorous and maintain the ability to use many different foods. Both strategies can be successful in different contexts, and the fossil record preserves examples of each. However, it is the broad base of small versatile mammals that underpins the later emergence of more extreme forms. By occupying the forest floor, low shrubs and shallow soil, and by feeding on a wide array of resources, these animals create a dense dynamic layer of activity close to the ground. Their continuous presence in this layer of the ecosystem contributes to nutrient cycling, seed dispersal, and the control of insect populations. In this way, small generalist mammals become key components of Paleogene terrestrial ecosystems, even though their individual bones and teeth are easy to overlook. They operate within the physical and biological framework set by climate, oceans, and vegetation, and their quiet but persistent success provides the immediate biological context for the later development of larger and more specialized mammal forms in other parts of the Paleogene record. Among the many small mammals that move through Paleogene forests, some develop body plans that allow especially fast and agile movement. Leptictidium is one such form known from late Paleocene and early Eocene rocks in parts of Europe. Its fossils give a detailed view of how a small mammal can adapt to a life built around quick running and jumping in a dense, warm woodland world. The known skeletons of Leptictidium show a body only a few tens of centimeters long, with the head, neck and trunk forming an elongated but lightly built frame. The hind limbs are much longer and more robust than the forelimbs, and the tail is long and stiffened by bony and ligamentous structures. These proportions indicate that the animal often moves using its hind legs as the main source of power, with the forelimbs playing a more limited role in support and manipulation. In life, this arrangement likely produces a series of rapid hops or bounds when the animal crosses open patches on the forest floor, and shorter, more careful steps when it moves within cluttered vegetation. The joints of the hind limbs, including the hip, knee and ankle, are shaped in a way that supports this interpretation. The thigh bone and the bones of the lower leg are elongated, and the surfaces where they meet are arranged to permit stable flexion and extension in a mainly front-to-back plane, helping to direct the force of each stride along the direction of travel. The ankle bones fit together in a way that limits twisting, but allows strong pushing motions, and some segments of the foot are lengthened to add extra leverage. Together, these features increase stride length and power, without requiring a large overall body size. The forelimbs, although shorter, retain flexible joints and dexterous hands, capable of grasping and manipulating food or clinging to irregular surfaces. This suggests that Leptictidium is not confined to a single mode of locomotion, but can combine upright hopping on the hind limbs with quadrupedal movements when needed. The vertebral column and tail provide further clues. The back shows a pattern of vertebrae that balance flexibility with the need for stability during rapid acceleration and landing. The tail vertebrae are numerous and reinforced in a way that would make the tail an effective counterbalance. During a hop or bound, this tail can be held in positions that help stabilize the body in mid-air and assist with rapid changes in direction when the animal lands. The combination of long hind limbs, reinforced tail and light body allows Leptictidium to move in short bursts that cover ground quickly, which is a useful trait both for escaping predators and for pursuing small prey in a complex environment. The skull of Leptictidium, although small, carries important information about diet and sensory abilities. The snout region is elongated and narrow, giving space for a long nasal cavity. This suggests a well-developed sense of smell, which is common in many small mammals that forage near the ground. The tooth row contains incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, with shapes consistent with an omnivorous or insect-rich diet. The molars have cusps and crests that can pierce and shear soft animal tissues, but also crush and grind some plant material. This tooth design fits with the idea that Leptictidium feeds on a mixture of insects, other small invertebrates, small vertebrates such as lizards or smaller mammals, and plant items like fruits and seeds when available. Jaw muscles attach to raised areas of the skull and to the lower jaw in ways that support a bite strong enough for small prey and mixed foods, but there is no sign of the extremely large jaw musculature seen in specialized bone crushers or large carnivores. The eye sockets are relatively large for the size of the skull, which points to an important role for vision. The exact pattern of daily activity is still under study, but large eyes in small mammals often indicate twilight or night activity, when light levels are low but movement is still possible. In such conditions, a combination of sensitive hearing, smell, and vision allows the animal to detect prey, predators, and obstacles in the forest floor environment. The inner ear structures, preserved in some related forms, suggest that these animals are able to detect rapid head movements and maintain balance during quick jumps and turns. This is consistent with the locomotor interpretation drawn from the limbs and tail. The habitats in which Leptictidium lives are warm, humid forests with thick leaf litter, fallen branches, and dense undergrowth. Fossil deposits that contain Leptictidium also preserve remains of plants, insects, and other vertebrates that share its environment. The presence of plant remains that indicate closed canopies, and the absence of strong seasonal cold means that food sources for a small omnivore are available throughout much of the year. Insects and other invertebrates live in rotting wood, and leaf litter fruits fall from trees, and small vertebrates move through the same layers of vegetation. In this setting, Leptictidium can exploit many types of food by moving swiftly between patches of resource-rich ground. Its long hind limbs allow it to cover larger areas than a similar-sized mammal with shorter legs in the same amount of time, and its agility helps it avoid becoming prey while it searches. The fossil record of Leptictidium and closely related forms is detailed enough to allow reconstructions of complete skeletons, which in turn support biomechanical studies. By comparing the shapes and proportions of bones with those of modern mammals that use known modes of locomotion, researchers can estimate how Leptictidium moves. Models show that the stresses on bones during simulated hopping are within safe limits for the observed bone thickness, and that the joint orientations reduce bending and twisting forces that could cause injury. This approach, combined with the distribution of limb muscle attachment sites, supports the interpretation of a specialized bipedal or near bipedal runner that can also use quadrupedal movement when slow, careful steps are needed. For example, when moving through dense roots or climbing over fallen trunks, it may lower its body and use all four limbs, reserving full bipedal hopping for more open spaces and escape responses. The evolutionary position of Leptictidium is also significant. It belongs to a group of mammals sometimes seen as part of an early radiation of placental mammals that explore a range of body plans and ways of life after the extinction of large reptiles. In this view, Leptictidium is one branch of a broader pattern in which different lineages experiment with gliding, digging, climbing, running, and other adaptations that later become more refined in other groups. The fact that Leptictidium and its relatives are already specialized in limb proportions and locomotion during the early Eocene indicates that the diversification of mammalian body plans is well underway by this time. Its existence supports the idea that the ecological space created by the extinction event is quickly filled by mammals with varied strategies, not only by slow enlargement of a single generalist form. The lifespan and reproduction of Leptictidium are not directly recorded in fossils, but by analogy with modern small mammals of similar size, it likely matures relatively quickly and produces several offspring per year. Such a life history pattern allows for rapid population growth when conditions are favourable, and provides many opportunities for natural selection to act on variation in locomotor and sensory traits. In a dynamic environment where climate events, local habitat shifts and ecological interactions can all change conditions, this rapid turnover may help maintain the lineage over millions of years, even if individual populations appear and disappear in the fossil record as local environments change. Interactions with other animals in the same fauna form part of the ecological role of leptictidium. It is potential prey for larger birds, snakes, crocodilians near water, and early mammalian carnivores. Its speed and agility, combined with the shelter provided by dense vegetation and burrows, reduce but do not remove this risk. At the same time, it is a predator of smaller animals and a consumer of plant matter, placing it in the middle levels of the food web. By feeding on insects and other invertebrates, it helps regulate their populations. By eating fruits and seeds, it may play a role in seed dispersal for some plants, either by dropping seeds in new locations or by depositing them in feces. Its burrowing or digging activities, if present, could help aerate soils and mix organic material into deeper layers. These functions, though performed by individuals that are physically small, contribute to the broader processes of nutrient cycling and energy flow in Paleogene forests. In summary, Leptictidium represents an early Paleogene mammal that illustrates how small body size can be combined with specialized locomotion and flexible feeding to produce a highly mobile, versatile animal. Its long hind limbs, balancing tail mixed dentition, and refined senses fit closely with a life spent moving quickly through warm stratified forests filled with insects, fruits, and small vertebrates. When seen against the background of greenhouse climate recovering vegetation and the rise of generalist mammals described in earlier sections, Leptictidium occupies a more focused niche, showing how some lineages move from broad generalist roles toward more defined combinations of movement and diet within the same overall Paleogene framework. In the Eocene epoch of the Paleogene, global climate reaches some of the warmest conditions of the entire Cenozoic era, and this warmth shapes landscapes on every continent. The greenhouse state already outlined for the early Paleogene becomes especially clear in the Eocene, with high levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, reduced temperature contrast between equator and poles, and the near absence of large continental ice sheets. Geological and fossil evidence from this time, including the distribution of warmth, loving plants, oxygen, isotope values in marine shells, and the presence of forest-adapted animals at high latitudes, all point to a world in which mild to hot conditions extend far toward the poles. In many regions, seasonal changes in temperature are modest compared with those experienced in later periods, and the main seasonal signals are in rainfall patterns, cloud cover, and day length, especially at high latitudes. On the continents, this background climate supports extensive forests that cover much of the land surface from equatorial zones through the middle latitudes and into polar regions. Tropical and subtropical forests with dense canopies and rich understories occupy low-latitude areas, while warm temperate forests extend across much of what are now mid-latitude continents. At still higher latitudes, forests composed of conifers and broadleaf trees grow under long summer days and short winter days, but generally mild temperatures. The presence of fossil wood leaves and pollen from such forests in regions that now lie well within polar circles confirms that ice sheets and tundra vegetation have not yet developed there. Instead, the Eocene high latitudes host swampy lowlands, river valleys, and upland slopes covered in trees with soils that thaw and support roots throughout much or all of the year. The arrangement of continents and seas during the Eocene controls how this warmth and moisture are distributed. Large ocean basins such as the ancestral Atlantic and the remnant Tethys Sea separate major landmasses while shallow seaways and broad continental shelves flood low-lying margins. In some places, such as around the margins of the Tethys chains of islands, peninsulas and small seas create complex coastlines that host mangroves, coastal swamps and estuaries. These environments act as transition zones between fully marine and fully terrestrial settings, moderating local climates and providing corridors for the movement of plants and animals. Inland river systems drain highlands and plateaus carrying water and sediment toward these shallow seas. Floodplains along these rivers are often wide and gently sloping with meandering channels that shift across their own deposits over time. Periodic flooding lays down layers of mud and sand that entomb the remains of plants and animals, creating rich fossil-bearing strata that later document the Eocene world. In some basins, especially those bounded by uplifts or volcanic highlands, rainfall and drainage patterns combine to form extensive lakes. These lakes vary in depth, surface area, and longevity, but many provide stable aquatic habitats for millions of years and accumulate thick sediments of mud, organic matter, and carbonate minerals. Within these layers, fine details of Eocene life and climate are preserved, including fish, invertebrates, plant fragments, pollen, and complete skeletons of land mammals that fall or are washed into the water. Topography during the Eocene is shaped by ongoing plate movements, mountain building, and volcanism. Some continental interiors are relatively low and flat, favouring slow-moving rivers and broad wetlands, while others experience uplift along mountain belts, where plates collide or slide past one another. Uplifted regions influence climate by intercepting moist air masses, producing orographic rainfall on windward slopes and creating rain shadows on leeward sides. This leads to variations in vegetation over short distances from cloud forests and dense woodlands, on rainy slopes, to more open forests and woodlands in drier rain shadow basins. Volcanic regions contribute ash and lava flows that locally bury vegetation and animals, but they also form fertile soils once weathering begins. The fine volcanic ash layers that settle over broad areas during eruptions become time markers in the rock record and provide minerals that plants use as nutrients when the ash becomes part of the soil. The Eocene atmosphere carries high amounts of water vapour, making many regions humid for long parts of the year. In tropical belts, frequent convection produces heavy rainfall, thunderstorms, and thick cloud cover. In warm temperate zones, rainfall may be more seasonal with wetter and drier periods in the year, but severe cold remains rare. At high latitudes, long summer days allow continuous photosynthesis in forest canopies for extended periods, while winters bring short days and long nights, but not the deep, prolonged freezing typical of later Ice Age climates. These conditions support distinctive forest structures with trees that can tolerate extended periods of low light and moderate cold, followed by intense summer growth. Embedded within this climatic framework are shorter-term events that leave clear signals in Eocene sediments. One of the most notable is a rapid warming event that begins close to the Paleocene-Eocene boundary, during which additional carbon enters the atmosphere and oceans over a geologically brief interval. During such events, temperatures rise by several degrees Celsius, and there is a shift toward lighter isotopic compositions of carbon and oxygen in marine and terrestrial materials, recording both warming and a change in the sources of carbon. On land, these events can cause shifts in the ranges of plants and animals, with warmth-tolerant species expanding into higher latitudes and elevations, and others retreating to refuges where conditions remain within their tolerances. Over tens to hundreds of thousands of years, feedback processes involving weathering sedimentation and carbon burial act to draw down the excess carbon, and temperatures gradually move back toward their prior levels, but the events demonstrate the sensitivity of the Eocene climate system to carbon inputs. Across the Eocene, longer-term trends also operate. In the earlier part of the epoch, greenhouse conditions are near their peak. while later in the Eocene there are signs of slow cooling and increasing climatic gradients, particularly toward the poles. These trends precede the more marked cooling and ice sheet growth of the Oligocene, but during most of the Eocene the landscape level effects are still those of a warm world. Forests remain widespread and fully open. Grass-dominated ecosystems are limited. Grasses are present, but they occupy roles within forest clearings, wetlands, and some drier slopes rather than forming the vast grasslands that appear later. Instead, many land surfaces are covered by trees, shrubs, and mixed herb layers, creating habitats with vertical structure and varied microclimates. The soils that form under these conditions are often deep and rich in organic matter. Warm temperatures and ample moisture promote rapid decomposition of leaf litter and dead wood, but constant plant growth replaces this material. In well-drained upland sites, soils may have distinct horizons with darker organic rich upper layers overlying more mineral-rich subsoil that contains clays and iron oxides. In low-lying wet areas, poor drainage leads to accumulation of peat and the development of thick organic deposits that can later transform into coal. These soils anchor forest vegetation and influence which plant species thrive in a given location. Where volcanic ash has fallen, soils may be especially rich in certain nutrients supporting lush plant growth and dense root systems that stabilize slopes. Eocene landscapes also include coastal plains where rivers meet the sea. Here tides, waves, and river currents interact to form deltas, estuaries, and barrier islands. Mangrove-like vegetation and salt-tolerant grasses and shrubs occupy intertidal zones while slightly higher ground. Host forests adapted to occasional flooding and brackish water. These coastal systems buffer the exchange of sediment and nutrients between land and ocean. They trap fine sediments and organic matter store carbon in waterlogged soils and provide habitats for a range of organisms that use both marine and freshwater resources. Periodic storms can reshape these coasts by breaching barrier islands, eroding shorelines, and depositing new layers of sand and silt. Over millions of years, the combination of steady processes and occasional large disturbances builds thick sequences of coastal sediments that preserve an integrated record of Eocene sea level climate and life. High sea levels in this greenhouse world mean that many present-day lowlands are underwater during the Eocene, and shorelines lie farther inland. This increases the area of shallow seas which absorb and store heat and influence nearby climates. The absence of large ice sheets keeps the global reflectivity relatively low, allowing more solar energy to be absorbed by Earth's surface. This reinforces the warm conditions and supports the continued existence of forests at high latitudes. Within this broad, warm and often humid setting, local climates still differ from place to place, but the range of variation is shifted toward warmer values compared with later periods. In summary, the Eocene greenhouse climate and its associated landscapes form a coherent outer layer of the Paleogene story, in which warmth, high sea levels and widespread forests define the broad conditions of life. Continents bathed in warm air and bordered by shallow seas support river networks, lakes, wetlands, mountain belts and coastal plains that all share the imprint of elevated temperatures and abundant moisture. These physical conditions shape the soils and plant communities that in turn provide the structural framework for the diversification of mammals and other animals, which occupy and transform these landscapes in the more inward layers of the Paleogene narrative. As Eocene forests spread across the Paleogene continents, some mammal lineages begin to specialize more clearly in feeding on plants, and among them the early horse relatives stand out as small browsers that move through dense woodland. Eohippus, also known in some work by another genus name, is one of the best known examples. Its fossils are found in Eocene rocks of North America and parts of Europe in deposits that also contain leaves, fruits, and other evidence of closed humid forests. The skeletal remains show an animal about the size of a small dog or fox. At the shoulder, it reaches roughly 30 to 50 centimeters in height, with a body that is relatively short and a tail that extends behind it. The limbs are slender, and the overall build is light, matching a life that depends on nimble movement among trunk shrubs and fallen branches. The structure of the feet in Eohippus differs strongly from that of modern horses. On the forelimbs it carries 4 toes, and on the hind limbs 3 toes, each ending in small hooves. The central toes bear most of the weight, while the outer toes support the foot on softer ground and help with balance on uneven surfaces. This multi-toed arrangement spreads forces across a wider area than a single hoof, which is useful in the soft soils of forest floors and along the muddy banks of streams and ponds. The joints of the limbs allow a degree of flexibility that suits careful stepping and short bursts of speed, rather than long-distance running in open terrain. This fits the forested Eocene landscape where roots, fallen logs and dense undergrowth require precise placements of the feet and frequent turns rather than extended straight-line sprints. The skull and teeth of Eohippus provide further information about its way of life. The head is proportionally small, with a relatively short face compared with later horse relatives. The molars and premolars have low crowns and rounded ridges suited to grinding soft plant material, such as leaves and fruits, not the abrasive grasses that dominate much later open grasslands. Enamel patterns on the chewing surfaces indicate that the teeth can process a mixture of tender foliage and possibly some tougher stems and seeds, but they are not built for continuous grazing on silica-rich grasses. The incisors at the front of the mouth clip vegetation, while the cheek teeth break it down into smaller fragments that are easier to digest. Where patterns on fossil teeth show that individuals use both sides of the jaw during chewing, which helps distribute forces and maintain tooth surfaces over the animal's lifespan. In contrast to some later herbivores that evolve very high crown teeth to cope with heavy wear, Eohippus retains lower crown teeth appropriate for its softer diet. The rest of the skeleton supports this interpretation of a forest browser. The neck is moderately long and flexible, allowing the head to move through a wide range as the animal selects leaves and fruits at different heights. The shoulder girdle and pelvis provide attachment sites for muscles that support both steady walking and quick dodging movements. Some aspects of the limb and spine anatomy have led researchers to suggest that Eohippus may be capable of modest climbing on sloping trunks or rough terrain, although it is not a climber in the sense of a primate or tree-dwelling carnivore. Instead, it is well suited to moving through 3-dimensional forest spaces that include low branches, fallen logs and small rises. The environment in which Eohippus lives is a warm, humid Eocene woodland. Pollen, leaves and wood from the same strata indicate dense forests, with a mix of evergreen and deciduous trees, shrubs, and an underlayer of ferns and herbs. In such forests, patches of light reach the ground where trees fall, or rivers open clearings, and in these gaps a rich understory of shrubs and small trees produces leaves and fruits within easy reach of a small browser. The soils are often soft and rich in organic matter, and seasonal flooding can create temporary wetlands and muddy margins where the multi-toed feet of Eohippus provide stable footing. Within this setting, Eohippus is not the only herbivore. Other mammals, including early relatives of tapirs, rhinoceroses, and various small browsing forms, share the plant resources. Some focus on leaves from higher branches, others specialize in tougher vegetation or aquatic plants near water bodies. The presence of Eohippus among this group illustrates a broader pattern in Paleogene herbivore evolution, in which many lineages explore different combinations of body size, limb structure and tooth form to use plant foods in different ways. Some remain small and forest-bound, while others gradually increase in size or shift toward more open habitats as climates and vegetation change. During the middle and later parts of the Paleogene, long-term cooling and changes in rainfall lead to the expansion of more open woodlands and early grass-rich areas in some regions. Grasses which already exist as part of the Paleogene flora begin to occupy larger spaces where fire grazing or dryness limit tree cover. As these habitats spread, herbivores that depend mostly on soft forest leaves face different conditions. Some follow retreating forests into regions where closed canopies persist, such as moist river valleys and coastal zones. Others adapt to patchier tree cover and more open ground by altering their diets and locomotion. In the horse lineage, fossil sequences show changes in tooth and limb structure through time that match this environmental shift. Later, Paleogene relatives develop somewhat higher crown teeth with more complex enamel patterns, better suited to processing food that includes more grit and perhaps more grass. Their limbs become longer and more specialized for efficient running, with the central toe taking on a greater share of the load and the side toes becoming reduced. These trends are gradual and vary between lineages, but they point toward a closer link between body design and the degree of openness in the habitat. In the Eocene and Oligocene context, however, many horse relatives remain small to medium in size and keep multiple toes, indicating that fully open grassland running is not yet the dominant mode. Other herbivores show their own adaptations in parallel. Chalicothere relatives develop unusual limb proportions and clawed front limbs that allow them to pull down branches and strip leaves while their hind limbs support a more upright posture. Early proboscideans in the Paleogene, such as forms related to Moeritherium, become semi-aquatic herbivores in swamps and river margins, feeding on water plants and soft vegetation. Large browsing mammals such as Arsinoitherium and Paraceratherium appear later in the Paleogene with massive bodies, strong limbs, and teeth specialized for processing leaves and branches from higher levels in woodlands and forest edges. Together, these herbivores assemble a community that uses plant resources from the forest floor to well above head height. The presence of multiple herbivore types in the same ecosystem suggests partitioning of food resources. Eohippus and its close relatives likely focus on low to mid-level vegetation fruits and tender shoots, while other species concentrate on different plant parts or different times of day. This reduces direct competition and allows several herbivores to coexist in the same forest or woodland. Evidence for this partitioning comes from comparisons of tooth shapes, where patterns body size and inferred head heights, as well as from the locations where fossils are found within ancient landscapes. For example, smaller forms often appear in deposits that represent more closed wetter environments, while larger browsers are sometimes associated with more open floodplains and upland areas. The digestive systems of Paleogene herbivores are not preserved directly, but general principles suggest that animals feeding mainly on soft leaves and fruits can maintain relatively simple gut structures compared with those that must break down large amounts of tough fiber or silica-rich grasses. Eohippus, as a browser, probably digests plant material through microbial fermentation in some part of the gut, but the demands on its teeth and digestive enzymes are lower than those faced by later grazing horses. This physiological context aligns with the observed dental morphology and with the forest environment where high-quality plant parts are more consistently available through the year than in strongly seasonal grasslands. The rise of diverse herbivore assemblages in the Paleogene has feedback effects on vegetation and soils. Browsing and fruit eating influence the growth patterns of plants, the dispersal of seeds, and the structure of undergrowth by moving seeds within their digestive tracts and depositing them with nutrients in feces. Herbivores like Eohippus contribute to the spread of certain tree and shrub species. Trampling by hooves and the creation of small paths open gaps in vegetation and expose soil which can favor germination of some plants. Over longer timescales, the combined activity of many herbivores helps shape the mosaic of forest density, with some areas remaining densely wooded and others maintaining more open understories. In this way, changing herbivore communities are both responses to and drivers of landscape structure within the Paleogene. In summary, the tiny horses of the Eocene represented by forms such as Eohippus illustrate a stage in mammal evolution, where small multi-toed browsers use warm closed forests as their main setting. Their teeth, limbs and body size all match the demands of moving through and feeding within dense vegetation. At the same time, the broader group of Paleogene herbivores, from small browsers to large high-level leaf feeders, responds to and influences gradual shifts toward more varied plant communities and more open habitats in some regions. Within the outer framework of greenhouse climate and widespread forests, these changing herbivores occupy the next layer of the Paleogene story, linking plant structure and animal anatomy in the ongoing evolution of mammal-dominated land ecosystems. In early and middle Paleogene forests, not all large land animals are mammals. In several regions of the northern hemisphere, the upper layers of the vegetation are shared with a group of large, flightless birds, of which Gastornis, also known in some older work by another name, is the best documented example. Fossils from North America, Europe, and parts of Asia show that these birds live from the late Paleocene into the Eocene during the same interval, when warm greenhouse climates and dense forests dominate large areas of land. Their bones appear in river and lake deposits that also contain remains of early horses, small primates and other mammals, linking them closely to the wooded environments already described. Gastornis stands roughly 1.8 to a little over 2 meters tall, with a robust body, long legs and a relatively short tail. The most striking feature is the head, which is large in proportion to the body and carries a massive beak. The beak is deep from top to bottom and thick from front to back, with a broad base where it attaches to the skull. Its overall shape is more block-like than the slender hooked beaks of specialized raptorial birds. The skull bones show expanded areas for muscle attachment, indicating that the jaw-closing muscles are strong and can generate considerable bite force. The neck vertebrae support this large head, and their articulations provide both strength and controlled flexibility, allowing the bird to move the head through a useful range, while still holding it steady when needed. The wings of Gastornis are markedly reduced compared with those of flying birds of similar mass. The bones are shortened, and some elements are fused, forming a compact structure that does not appear capable of sustained flapping flight. The feather covering is not preserved in detail, but by analogy with living large birds, and the structure of the wing bones, it is reasonable to infer that the wings play little or no role in propulsion, and may be used mainly for balance display or stabilization during movement. The legs, in contrast, are well developed. The thigh bones, shins, and ankle elements are thick and strong, and the joints are arranged to support the weight of a large body, while still allowing a functional stride. The feet end in strong toes with claws that can grip soil and vegetation. Overall, the proportions of the hind limbs suggest a walker that can move with steady steps and probably short bursts of faster motion, rather than a long-distance runner adapted to open plains. This fits a life spent in forests and woodlands, where dense undergrowth and irregular ground reward stability and maneuverability. For many years, the diet of Gastornis is a subject of debate. The large size, powerful beak and imposing appearance lead to early interpretations of this bird as a top predator that hunts small mammals and other vertebrates in the Paleogene forests. However, more recent work that combines beak shape analysis, biomechanics, isotope measurements in preserved bone and comparisons with living birds suggests a different picture. The deep broad beak and the pattern of wear on its surfaces are now often interpreted as more consistent with a diet that includes a large proportion of plant material such as tough seeds, nuts, and fibrous vegetation, possibly with some additional animal items. The microscopic structure of the bone mineral and the balance of certain isotopes in the fossils also support a position lower in the food chain than a purely carnivorous predator. At the same time, the strong beak and jaws would still be capable of cracking hard plant parts, or when needed delivering strong defensive bites. This combination of features points toward a large, mainly herbivorous or omnivorous bird, rather than a specialized mammal-hunting predator, although some uncertainty remains, and different populations or species within the broader group may occupy slightly different positions in their food webs. The environments that Gastornis inhabits are warm, humid forests and woodlands of the Paleocene and Eocene. Pollen and leaf fossils from the same strata show dense stands of broadleaf trees, ferns and shrubs, with soils that are often soft and rich in organic matter. In such settings, a tall bird can use its height and reach to take leaves, fruits and seeds from branches and shrubs that are too high for many smaller mammals. The strong beak allows it to process tough plant tissues that might be difficult for other herbivores to crack. If, as some evidence suggests, Gastornis also eats small animals on occasion, these would be available in the same environment as insects, small reptiles, and small mammals that move through the undergrowth or live in leaf litter. The locomotion and posture of Gastornis can be inferred from the skeleton. The alignment of the leg bones and the shape of the joints indicate an upright stance with the body held over the centre of support, similar in general terms to large ground-dwelling birds today. The hip and knee joints allow flexion and extension in a mainly front-to-back plane, which stabilizes the leg during walking. The ankle structure supports the transfer of body weight onto the toes during each step. These features promote efficient, steady movement over forest floors, stream margins, and perhaps more open clearings. The tail and reduced wings may help with balance during turns or when moving over uneven ground. The centre of mass located near the hips fits with a stable bipedal gait. In terms of behaviour, fossils offer indirect clues. The density of Gastornis remains in some localities suggests that these birds can be among the more common large vertebrates in their habitats, at least in some time intervals. Footprints that might belong to related forms show trackways consistent with walking rather than running. The arrangement of bones in some sites indicates that individuals sometimes die near water bodies such as lakes or rivers, where their remains are more likely to be preserved. There is currently limited direct evidence for nesting sites, eggs, or juvenile individuals, so details of breeding and social structure remain uncertain. By comparison with large birds today, it is plausible that Gastornis lays a small number of relatively large eggs and invests significant parental effort in rearing young, but this remains an inference rather than a firmly documented fact. The presence of Gastornis in ecosystems dominated by mammals and other birds adds another layer to Paleogene community structure. As a large ground-dwelling bird that feeds heavily on plants, it shares some roles with mammalian herbivores, yet its body plan and ancestry differ. It may compete with mammals for some resources such as fruit seeds and low-hanging leaves, while also using plant parts that are less accessible to quadrupedal browsers. Its size and beak likely deter many potential predators, although large crocodilians near water bodies and some of the larger mammalian carnivores could pose a threat particularly to juveniles. In turn, Gastornis may influence vegetation by its feeding seed dispersal and movement patterns. By consuming fruits and excreting seeds at some distance from parent plants, they can help establish seedlings in new areas. By repeatedly moving along certain routes, it may create narrow paths through undergrowth which other animals can later use. Over time, these interactions contribute to the fine-scale patchiness of forest structure. The geographic and temporal distribution of Gastornis and related large flightless birds also carries information about Paleogene geography and climate. Fossils in Europe and North America indicate that these continents share broadly similar avian faunas during parts of the early Paleogene, which aligns with evidence for land connections and similar climates at certain latitudes. Finds in Asia suggest that these birds or their close relatives extend further east, following suitable forested habitats across connected land masses. As climates begin to cool toward the end of the Eocene and into the Oligocene, vegetation patterns change in some regions. Forests contract in certain areas, and more open woodlands and early grass-dominated patches expand. This shift likely reduces the continuous areas of dense humid forest that large ground-dwelling browsers like Gastornis prefer. In combination with other factors such as competition from increasingly diverse large mammals and changes in sea level and geography, this environmental change may contribute to the decline and eventual disappearance of these birds. The exact timing and causes of their extinction are still under study, and different regions may show different histories, but overall their record fades as the Paleogene progresses into its cooler phases. Within the Paleogene narrative focused on the rise of mammals, Gastornis and similar birds show that large terrestrial niches are not filled by mammals alone. They represent an alternative way for vertebrates to become large plant consumers or mix feeders in warm forested settings. Their skeletons, beaks, and inferred diets provide a clear example of how evolution can produce similar ecological roles from very different starting points. In this case, a lineage of birds that originally evolved flight and then loses it in favour of a ground-based life. In the layered structure of Paleogene ecosystems, these birds occupy an important component of the middle to upper height range in forests and woodlands, coexisting with and sometimes overlapping in function with the growing diversity of mammalian herbivores and omnivores that share the same warm, densely vegetated continents. Along the slow rivers, swamps, and lagoons of the Paleogene, some mammals begin to divide their lives between water and land, and among them the early proboscideans form an important bridge between small terrestrial generalists and the much larger elephant lineage of later times. In warm Eocene lowlands of what is now northern Africa, broad floodplains, backwater pools, and shallow channels occupy depressions along the margins of ancient seas. The climate is humid and warm, with forests and woodlands growing on slightly higher ground, and reed beds, sedges, and aquatic plants filling the wetter zones. In this setting, animals that can move easily through both soft ground and shallow water find rich supplies of soft vegetation with relatively few large competitors. Merotherium, an early proboscidean, is one of these animals. Its fossils show a mammal about the size of a modern tapir, with a body length of roughly 2 to almost 3 meters and a shoulder height near 1 meter. The body is compact and sturdy, with a broad chest and a torso that suggests strong musculature for pushing through water and mud. The limbs are relatively short but robust, with wide feet that spread weight over soft substrates and reduce sinking. This combination of traits matches an animal that spends much time wading and standing in shallow water, walking along muddy banks and only occasionally moving more quickly over firmer ground. The skull of Merotherium differs from that of later elephants, but already shows some features characteristic of the proboscidean lineage. The face is elongated compared with many other mammals of similar size, and the nasal openings are positioned higher on the skull than in typical terrestrial forms, suggesting the presence of a short, flexible trunk or a muscular upper lip that can reach and grasp. The teeth include enlarged incisors in the upper jaw that project slightly forward precursors of the more pronounced tusks seen in later proboscideans. The cheek teeth are low-crowned and patterned for grinding soft water, rich plants rather than very tough grasses or woody stems. Their enamel forms ridges and basins that, together with wear surfaces, indicate a diet dominated by aquatic and semi-aquatic vegetation, such as water plants, soft leaves, and perhaps some fruits and stems gathered near the water's edge. The jaw muscles attach to expanded regions on the skull, providing the force needed to process large volumes of fibrous but not extremely abrasive plant matter. The position of the eyes and ears on the skull supports the idea of a semi-aquatic lifestyle. The eyes sit relatively high, allowing Merotherium to see above the water surface, while much of the body is submerged, and the ears are placed so that they can remain above water, when the animal stands or moves in deeper pools. The nasal region with its elevated opening would permit breathing while the head is held low, and a short trunk or flexible lip would help gather plants without the need to bring the entire head out of the water each time. Together, these features recall some aspects of modern hippos and tapirs, although Merotherium belongs to a different lineage and follows its own evolutionary path. The bones of the limbs and shoulders of Merotherium show adaptations to support weight in both water and on land. The shoulder girdle is strong with broad areas for muscle attachment that allow powerful forward and downward strokes of the forelimbs, useful for pushing through mud and loose sediment. The pelvis and hind limbs provide stable support when the animal stands, and the joints are arranged to permit a steady, deliberate walk rather than fast running. The feet likely carry broad pads and multiple toes that spread out under load-improving traction and stability on soft ground. In deeper water, the body's buoyancy reduces the effective weight on the limbs, and the same strong legs that support slow walking on land help with wading and gentle swimming. Merotherium does not possess the streamlined body or specialized paddles of later fully aquatic mammals, but its anatomy fits well with a lifestyle in shallow, calm waters. The habitats where Merotherium lives are part of larger river and delta systems that drain into the warm seas of the Eocene. Along these rivers, channels split and rejoin, forming oxbow lakes, marshes and backwaters. Floods during wetter seasons expand the flooded area, depositing fresh layers of silt and clay, and creating new patches of aquatic vegetation as water levels fall again. Trees and shrubs line some banks their roots, stabilizing soils, while other stretches are occupied by open wetlands with floating and emergent plants. In these zones, Merotherium finds abundant soft plant material both above and below the water surface. It can graze on submerged stems, crop floating leaves, and reach up with its trunk or lip to pull down branches and leaves from low overhanging trees. This range of feeding options helps buffer the animal against short-term changes in water level and plant growth. Merotherium shares these wetlands with other animals. Crocodilians lurk in deeper pools and slow channels, feeding on fish, and at times on mammals and other vertebrates that enter the water. Small and medium-sized fish move among the plants insects breed in shallow pools, and amphibians call and hunt along the margins. On the nearby dry ground, early perissodactyls, small primates and other mammals move through woodlands and forests. The semi-aquatic herbivore occupies a distinct niche within this community, focusing on water plants and soft bankside vegetation that many fully terrestrial browsers do not exploit as heavily. Its size helps reduce the risk from smaller predators, but young individuals are vulnerable, and the presence of large crocodilians means that caution is likely an important part of its daily behavior. The fossil record of Merotherium comes mainly from Eocene deposits in northern Africa, especially in regions that preserve coastal and fluvial sediments. Associated fossils show that these deposits represent environments near the margin of an ancient sea that connects what is now the Mediterranean region with the Indian Ocean through the Tethys realm. This paleogeographic setting helps explain the mixture of marine and terrestrial influences seen in the fauna and flora. Merotherium is often found in beds that also contain remains of early whales, fish turtles and other mammals, indicating that shallow marine estuarine and fluvial habitats are closely intertwined. In such a dynamic zone, the ability to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources offers clear advantages. From an evolutionary standpoint, Merotherium occupies an early branch of the proboscidean family tree. More basal land-dwelling forms precede it, and later larger proboscideans follow. Its anatomy illustrates an intermediate stage in which some traits of elephants and their relatives are already present, but in a smaller semi-aquatic animal. The short trunk or flexible upper lip foreshadows the long muscular trunk of later elephants, while the modestly enlarged incisors anticipate the development of full tusks. The structure of the cheek teeth shows the beginning of the trend toward more complex grinding surfaces that can handle a variety of plant materials. At the same time, the small size and semi-aquatic habits differ from the massive, mostly terrestrial elephants of later Cenozoic epochs. Merotherium therefore demonstrates that the proboscidean line does not move directly from small land mammals to large savanna elephants in a single step, but passes through stages that explore different environments and feeding strategies. Other semi-aquatic mammals of the Paleogene, though not proboscideans, illustrate parallel experiments in exploiting water-edge habitats. Early relatives of Sirenians, the group that later includes manatees and dugongs, appear in some of the same broad regions. These animals eventually become fully aquatic plant eaters in coastal and riverine environments, with more streamlined bodies and paddle-like limbs. In contrast, Merotherium and its closest proboscidean relatives remain tied to shallow water and land. Together, these lineages show that in warm Paleogene climates, with widespread wetlands and shallow seas, herbivorous mammals follow several paths into aquatic and semi-aquatic roles, each shaped by its inherited anatomy and local conditions. Over the later Paleogene, long-term cooling trends and changes in sea level alter the distributions of wetlands and coastal plains. In some areas, the retreat of shallow seas and the uplift of land reduce the extent of lagoons and swamps, while in others, river systems reorganize as tectonic movements reshape basins. These shifts likely influence the habitats available to semi-aquatic proboscideans and related forms. Some lineages adapt by moving into new regions where suitable wetlands remain. Others change their diets and behaviors, and some disappear. The detailed timing of the decline of Merotherium is still refined as new fossils are found and dated, but its presence in Eocene sediments and absence from later Oligocene and Neogene deposits indicate that it does not persist into cooler, more open landscapes, dominated by different kinds of herbivores. In the broader Paleogene story, Merotherium and similar early proboscideans represent a step inward from general climatic and vegetational patterns toward the specific ways large and medium-sized herbivores use water-rich environments. Their bodies record the balance between land and water in their daily lives. Their teeth and jaws record the types of plants that grow in Eocene wetlands, and their geographic distribution records the shape of ancient coastlines and rivers. When these lines of evidence are placed alongside those from forests, small mammals and large birds, a coherent picture emerges of Paleogene lowlands as complex mosaics of dry ground, wet ground, and shallow water, within which semi-aquatic grazers like Merotherium play a quiet but crucial role in turning plant production into animal biomass and linking aquatic and terrestrial parts of the ecosystem. Along the warm coasts of the early Eocene, where rivers meet shallow seas and broad tidal flats, fringe low deltas, some mammals begin to divide their time between land and water in a way that goes beyond simple wading. Ambulocetus natans, a walking whale, is one of the clearest examples of this stage. Fossils from what is now northern Pakistan show an animal that lives about 49 million years ago in coastal shallow seas and brackish rivers linked to the ancient Tethys realm. The skeleton records a body that is long and low, roughly 3 meters from snout to tail, with strong limbs and a skull that already carries several features seen in later whales. At this point in the Paleogene, large marine reptiles are gone from the oceans and many ecological roles in coastal waters are open. Ambulocetus occupies part of this space as a predator that can move between shore and channel, using both walking and swimming, but it still depends on solid ground in ways that later whales no longer do. The vertebral column of Ambulocetus supports a flexible spine, and the ribs and shoulder girdle are robust, giving the torso the strength needed to push and pull a heavy body in water and on land. The limbs are large and powerful, but their proportions differ from those of typical land mammals. The legs are relatively squat with joints that splay outward from the body, rather than holding the limbs directly under the trunk. The hind feet are particularly large and probably webbed, forming broad surfaces that can push against water. On land, this arrangement makes upright walking inefficient. Ambulocetus likely moves with a kind of lumbering walk or crawl, with the body held low and the limbs pushing out to the sides, similar in outline to the way modern sea lions haul themselves across beaches. Each step involves lifting part of the body and dragging the rest forward, which is slow over distance but adequate for short trips between water and resting sites. In water, the same limb design becomes an advantage. When submerged, the dense body is partly supported by buoyancy, and the large hind feet act as powerful paddles. Ambulocetus probably swims using a combination of spinal flexion and hind limb strokes, not yet with the full tail-driven motion of later whales, but with movements that recall a large otter. With each stroke, the hind legs sweep backward, and the webbed feet push against the surrounding water, driving the animal forward. The forelimbs play a smaller role in propulsion, acting more as stabilizers and steering surfaces as the animal adjusts its position in rivers and shallow seas. The skull of Ambulocetus provides detailed information about its senses and feeding. The jaws are long and contain tall, sharp molars and premolars that interlock when the mouth closes. These teeth suggest a diet that includes fish and other animals that enter the water, such as small to medium-sized vertebrates. The large space for the temporalis muscle, which closes the jaws, indicates a powerful bite strong enough to hold struggling prey and to process flesh and bone. One of the most informative features lies in the lower jaw. Inside the bone is a large cavity that in modern toothed whales houses a pad of fat. In living whales, this fat pad channels sound from the jaw to the middle ear, allowing sensitive underwater hearing. In Ambulocetus, the presence of a similar cavity suggests that a related system is already developing. The bone around this region is thinner than in many wholly terrestrial mammals, which would help transmit sound waves. Although the full auditory specializations of modern whales are not yet present, this configuration indicates that Ambulocetus can detect sounds conducted through water with a sensitivity beyond that of typical land mammals, an advantage for a predator hunting in murky or complex aquatic settings. The position of the eyes adds another piece to the picture. The orbits are placed high on the skull so that when the head is held with the jaw somewhat lowered, the gaze is directed partly upward and forward. This pattern resembles that of modern hippopotamuses, in which eyes, ears and nostrils sit high on the head and remain above water, while most of the body is submerged. In Ambulocetus, high-set eyes would allow the animal to keep watch on the water surface, while the rest of the head and body stay hidden. If it rests or moves along the bottom of a river or lagoon, with only the eyes and perhaps the nostrils raised, it can monitor potential prey swimming above. This arrangement suits an ambush hunting strategy in which the predator waits near channels or drop-offs and then bursts upward to grab passing animals. The environment in which Ambulocetus lives supports such a lifestyle. Coastal Pakistan in the early Eocene lies near the shores of the Tethys Sea, with lowlands, river mouths and shallow marine shelves. Warm water covers these areas and tides, and river flows mix salt and fresh water to form brackish channels. Fish invertebrates and other aquatic life are abundant, and terrestrial animals come to the water to drink or to feed along the margins. In this mosaic of mudflats, channels and sandbars, a predator that can move in both domains finds many opportunities. Ambulocetus may rest on sand or mud banks between hunting bouts, and then slide back into the water to search for prey. Its slow movement on land limits long-distance travel, so it likely remains within a home range that includes both river segments and nearby coastal waters. From an evolutionary perspective, Ambulocetus stands at an intermediate point between fully terrestrial mammal ancestors and the fully aquatic whales that appear later in the Paleogene. Its skeleton retains clear evidence of weight-bearing limbs and a body plan suited to life on land, yet those limbs are already modified for swimming, and the skull and jaw show adaptations for underwater sound reception and aquatic predation. However, in this section, the emphasis remains on the animal itself and its immediate surroundings. The presence of Ambulocetus in the fossil record shows that in the warm coastal settings of the early Eocene, some mammals are already committing to a life that depends on both land and water. Its heavy, low-slung body, large hind feet, powerful jaws and evolving sensory systems all reflect this dual existence, providing a clear view of how a walking predator begins to turn into a swimming hunter within the broader Paleogene seas and shorelines. Later in the Eocene, as greenhouse seas remain warm and shallow, shelves still fringe many continents. The whale lineage includes forms that are no longer tied to land at all, and among these fully aquatic archaeocetes, Basilosaurus and Dorudon are especially well known. Their skeletons, preserved in places such as the Valley of the Whales in Egypt and other former margins of the Tethys Sea, show bodies that are completely adapted to life in water. Limbs that once supported walking are now transformed into steering and stabilizing structures. Hind limbs are reduced to small vestiges, and the relationship between skull, spine and tail indicates swimming that depends on vertical undulations rather than paddling on the seafloor. Basilosaurus, despite the early naming that suggests a reptile, is a very large early whale. Individuals reach lengths of more than a dozen meters, with some estimates for the longest skeletons approaching 20 meters and body masses that can reach many tons. The vertebral column is unusually elongated, with numerous tall, narrow vertebrae that give the body a long serpentine outline compared with the more compact shapes of many later whales. The ribs and vertebrae are filled in ways that indicate an unusual distribution of marrow and bone, which affects buoyancy. In particular, the limb and trunk bones show patterns that help Basilosaurus maintain a position near the surface, rather than sinking deeply. This combination of length and buoyancy fits an animal that spends much of its time cruising through warm surface waters of epicontinental seas, turning its long body in arcs as it swims. The skull of Basilosaurus is large, but when compared with body size, the brain case is relatively small, suggesting a brain that is not as expanded as in modern toothed whales that use complex social behavior and echolocation. The jaws are armed with differentiated teeth, including incisors, canines, premolars and molars. The cheek teeth are pointed and laterally compressed with cutting edges suited to slicing flesh, where patterns on these teeth show that they are used actively in chewing, not just in gripping and swallowing prey whole. The combination of sharp cusps and evidence of wear points to a diet of sizable prey that requires processing such as large fish and smaller marine mammals. The strong jaw muscles inferred from the areas of muscle attachment on the skull support a powerful bite that can seize and dismember animals in the water column. Fossil evidence from some sites indicates that Basilosaurus may feed on smaller whales and other vertebrates, placing it near the top of the food web in Eocene seas. The postcranial skeleton of Basilosaurus shows forelimbs transformed into flippers. The upper arm bone, forearm bones and hand bones are shortened and flattened with joints that limit movement to a relatively narrow range, useful for steering and stabilization rather than weight-bearing. The scapula and shoulder girdle provide broad areas for muscle attachment, allowing precise control of these flippers during changes in direction. The pelvis and hind limbs are greatly reduced and are no longer connected to the main weight-bearing structures of the spine. Small hind limb bones persist but are too small and too isolated within muscle and connective tissue to play any meaningful role in propulsion or support. Instead, the main engine of movement lies in the long vertebral column and tail. Although the soft tissues are not preserved, the shape of the tail vertebrae suggests the presence of a tail fluke that oscillates up and down as Basilosaurus swims, much like in modern whales, with the rest of the body contributing to undulating motion. Dorudon, which lives in roughly the same late Eocene seas, is smaller but shares many of these fully aquatic features. Adult Dorudon individuals reach lengths of about 5 meters, near the size of a modern beluga whale. The body is more compact than that of Basilosaurus, with a shorter vertebral column and a proportionally larger head. The skull bears a long, narrow snout with a full set of heterodont teeth. Incisors and canines at the front seize prey, while premolars and molars behind them show distinct shapes that can be assigned to tooth types, unlike the more uniform tooth rows of many living-toothed whales. This pattern indicates that Dorudon still chews its food and uses differentiated teeth to process it. The preserved skulls show a large mandibular foramen, the opening in the lower jaw that in modern toothed whales houses a fat pad used for underwater sound transmission. The bone around this opening is thin, which would allow sound waves travelling through water and tissue to pass into the skull efficiently. This configuration suggests that Dorudon, like later odontocetes, can use its lower jaw as a pathway for underwater hearing with good sensitivity. At the same time, the skull lacks the bulbous melon of modern toothed whales, a soft tissue structure at the front of the head that focuses sound in echolocation. This indicates that although underwater hearing is advanced compared with purely terrestrial mammals, the full echolocation system seen in many modern species has not yet evolved. Fossilized stomach contents in some Dorudon specimens provide direct evidence of diet, including fish bones preserved within the rib cage. This supports the interpretation of Dorudon as a mid-level predator, feeding mainly on fish and perhaps smaller marine vertebrates. The jaw musculature and tooth wear patterns allow for powerful bites and repeated chewing, consistent with this diet. The ear bones of Dorudon, like those of Basilosaurus, are dense and show partial isolation from the rest of the skull by surrounding air spaces. This arrangement improves directional hearing underwater by reducing the transmission of sound through skull bones and favouring detection of pressure waves through tissues and specialised structures. The combination of dense ear bones, mandibular fat pads, and jaw foramina indicates that by the late Eocene, early whales have a sophisticated set of auditory adaptations for life in the sea, even if some later refinements are still absent. The postcranial anatomy of Dorudon is that of a fully aquatic swimmer. The forelimbs are flippers with shortened and flattened bones and limited joint mobility. As in Basilosaurus, the pelvis and hind limbs are reduced and no longer support the body or contribute significantly to locomotion. The vertebral column in the tail region shows features associated with attachment of strong muscles that drive a tail fluke. The overall body plan points to swimming powered by vertical tail beats, with the flippers acting as control surfaces for pitch and roll. Unlike Ambulocetus and other earlier archaeocetes, Dorudon shows no signs of being able to support its weight on land, and its entire life cycle, including birth and nursing, likely occurs in the water. The environments that host Basilosaurus and Dorudon are parts of the warm Tethyan seas and other connected ocean basins. The Valley of the Whales in Egypt, for example, preserves a shallow marine setting within the ancient Tethys, where sediments accumulate on the seafloor and entomb the skeletons of whales, fish sharks, and other marine organisms. The presence of both large Basilosaurus skeletons and smaller Dorudon remains in the same general region suggests a structured marine community in which different whale species occupy different trophic levels and use different parts of the water column. Basilosaurus, with its large size and surface-adapted buoyancy, likely hunts in near-surface and mid-water zones and may prey on smaller whales, including Dorudon, as well as large fish. Dorudon, more agile and smaller, likely feeds mainly on fish and small vertebrates, and may be prey for larger predators at times. Both species depend on the continued productivity of Eocene seas, in which plankton, fish, and invertebrates form complex food webs. Together, Basilosaurus and Dorudon show that by the late Eocene the transition from land to water in whales has progressed to a point where some lineages are entirely marine with bodies and senses shaped by the physical demands of swimming and hearing in seawater. Their skulls carry the traces of how jaws turn into tools for underwater sound reception. Their spines and limbs show how walking structures become flukes and flippers, and their fossils in shallow marine sediments record the presence of large mammalian predators that now occupy roles once held by marine reptiles. Within the Paleogene narrative, they represent a stage in which mammals not only dominate land, but also claim a strong presence in the open ocean, adding a fully aquatic component to the diversification that follows the end of the age of dinosaurs. On land during the Paleogene, as herbivorous mammals expand in size and variety, large predators and omnivores also develop forms that make use of the new prey and scavenging opportunities. In the Middle Eocene of what is now Inner Mongolia and nearby regions of China, Andrewsarchus is one of the most striking examples. It is known mainly from a single large skull, so interpretations rely heavily on that specimen and comparisons with related animals. The skull is nearly 1 meter long with a broad snout and robust jaws. The teeth include incisors, canines, premolars and molars that together indicate a capacity for both tearing flesh and crushing harder items such as bone. The canines are strong and conical, suited to seizing and holding prey, while the premolars and molars bear thick enamel and large surfaces that can crack and grind. Muscle attachment areas on the skull, particularly around the temporal region, and the lower jaw suggest powerful jaw-closing muscles. Body size estimates based on the skull and on proportions of related taxa indicate an animal comparable in shoulder height to a large horse, and with a body length of several meters. Mass estimates vary, but place it well above most modern terrestrial carnivores, approaching or exceeding the size of large bears. The skeleton is poorly known, but reconstructions indicate a body supported on strong limbs, capable of moving across coastal lowlands and gently rolling terrain in a warm Eocene climate. Fossil evidence places Andrewsarchus in a coastal setting near the margins of the Eocene seas, where rivers, tidal flats and coastal plains provide a mixture of prey types and scavenging opportunities. In such an environment, a large carnivore or omnivore can feed on carcasses, washed ashore hunt medium to large herbivores near water sources and exploit nesting sites of other animals. The combination of robust crushing teeth and cutting edges indicates a flexible diet that may include meat bone and possibly some plant material or shellfish, although the limited skeletal material leaves room for uncertainty. The climate at this time is still warm and humid, with forests and woodlands extending across much of the region, and coastal wetlands and floodplains providing rich habitats. Andrewsarchus operates as a top-level consumer within these systems, its large skull and jaw musculature, allowing it to process large packages of food when available. Later in the Paleogene, a different group of large mammals, the entelodonts, occupies a wide range of carnivorous and omnivorous roles across Eurasia and North America. These animals, sometimes informally called hell pigs, are not true pigs, but belong to their own extinct family. They appear in the late Eocene and persist into the Miocene, with many species living during the Oligocene, which forms the final epoch of the Paleogene. Entelodonts such as Entelodon and related genera show a characteristic skull shape, large and elongated with heavy jaws, prominent bony flanges on the lower jaw, and the rear of the skull and long curved canine teeth that project from the front of the mouth. The jaw flanges likely serve as attachment sites for strong jaw muscles and may also help protect those muscles during biting. The cheek teeth present a combination of sharper cusps and broader surfaces suited to slicing meat, crushing bone and grinding plant material. This dental pattern and the wear marks on fossil teeth indicate an omnivorous diet that includes both animal and plant resources. Body size varies among entelodont species. Some reach shoulder heights of around 1.5 to nearly 2 meters and body lengths of several meters, with masses comparable to or greater than that of modern large cattle. The limbs are relatively long and end in hooves, reflecting a more cursorial lifestyle than that of heavy swamp dwellers. The limb bones and joint surfaces suggest that entelodonts are capable of steady, efficient walking and moderate running across open woodlands, floodplains, and more open country that becomes more common as climates cool and forests thin in some regions during the Oligocene. The structure of the skeleton supports a body held high off the ground with a deep chest and strong shoulders and hips. The skull anatomy of entelodonts, with large nasal openings and expanded areas for muscle attachment, hints at well-developed senses of smell and strong jaw function. The position of the eyes allows a wide field of view useful for both detecting prey and monitoring surroundings. Fossil trackways and bone assemblages suggest that entelodonts may sometimes interact with carcasses of other animals, including large herbivores, either as active predators or as scavengers. Bite marks on bones match the tooth patterns of entelodonts in some cases, indicating that they can crack large bones and access marrow. The strong canines and jaw strength also make intraspecific combat plausible, perhaps over food or access to mates, although the specific behaviours are inferred rather than directly observed. In the same broad Cenozoic interval but in a different region, and somewhat later in time, saber-toothed predators such as Thylacophilus appear in South America. Thylacophilus is not a Paleogene animal, as it lives mainly in the late Miocene and Pliocene, but its anatomy provides a clear example of how predatory mammals in the wider Cenozoic repeatedly evolve similar solutions to capturing large prey. Thylacophilus is a sporacodont more closely related to marsupial mammals than to placental cats, yet its skull carries long, slender upper canine teeth that extend well beyond the lower jaw when the mouth is closed. The roots of these canines extend high into the skull, and the lower jaw bears bony flanges that protect the teeth when the jaws are shut. Body size estimates place Thylacophilus in the range of a large modern big cat, with a body length of about 1 to 1.5 meters and a mass similar to that of a jaguar. The forelimbs are robust with large areas for muscle attachment, suggesting strong gripping power useful for subduing prey at close range. The cheek teeth are reduced, indicating that the long canines and strong bite are specialized tools for delivering deep, precise bites rather than for heavy chewing of bone. These traits illustrate convergent evolution where unrelated lineages in different regions develop similar functional features under comparable ecological pressures. Within the Paleogene, a variety of lineages begin to move in this direction, even if the full saber-toothed morphology of Thylacophilus and later cat lineages appears afterwards. Across these examples, large Paleogene predators and omnivores share several functional themes. They tend to have disproportionately large skulls relative to body size, with expanded regions for jaw muscle attachment, and specialized teeth that allow both seizing prey and processing tough tissues. Their limb structures balance the need for supporting substantial body mass with the capacity for movement across varied terrain, from coastal plains and floodplains to more open woodlands and early grass-rich environments. Their sensory systems, inferred from skull openings and brain case shape support, keen smell and vision suited to detecting prey and competitors. They occupy upper levels of food webs in ecosystems that already include diverse herbivores, small mammals, birds and reptiles. The fossil record also records their interactions with their environments through preserved bite marks, broken bones and carcass distributions. Bones of large herbivores bearing tooth marks consistent with Andrewsarchus or entelodont jaws indicate active predation or intensive scavenging. The geographic distributions of these predators track the availability of suitable habitats. Andrewsarchus appears in Eocene coastal basins of Asia, where warm climate and coastal forests provide a mix of prey and carrion. Entelodonts spread across Eurasia and into North America, as Oligocene climates become more seasonal and open habitats expand, using their omnivorous diet and strong legs to move across larger home ranges. Later saber-toothed predators in other regions, though beyond the Paleogene, demonstrate that as large herbivores continue to evolve, predators keep pace with new skull and limb specializations. Within the Paleogene itself, the rise of powerful land predators such as Andrewsarchus and Entelodonts marks an inward step from the general pattern of mammal diversification toward the specific forms that occupy the top of terrestrial food webs, operating alongside the large herbivores, flightless birds and semi-aquatic mammals that share the same dynamic landscapes. As the Paleogene advances toward its later stages, the long greenhouse interval begins to give way to cooler, more variable conditions, and this climatic shift leaves a clear imprint on both marine and terrestrial habitats. In the earlier Paleogene, warm temperatures and small contrast between equator and poles support extensive forests and high sea levels, but by the late Eocene and into the Oligocene, evidence from marine oxygen, isotopes, plant fossils and sedimentary patterns indicates that global temperatures decline, and polar regions start to cool more strongly than the tropics. The temperature gradient between low and high latitudes increases, and this strengthened gradient alters winds, ocean currents, and patterns of rainfall. Continental positions continue to evolve as plates move and new ocean gateways open or deepen, changing how water flows around Antarctica and between other basins. These changes in circulation help isolate high-latitude air masses, allowing the growth of persistent ice on parts of Antarctica and contributing to a global drop in sea level as water becomes locked in ice sheets. On land, the cooling climate influences vegetation. In some low-latitude regions, tropical and subtropical forests remain, but their ranges contract in certain areas, especially at higher altitudes, and latitudes where cooler temperatures and increased seasonality make continuous evergreen cover less stable. Warm temperate forests shift toward more deciduous compositions, with trees that lose leaves during cooler or drier seasons, and at still higher latitudes, forests thin or disappear, giving way to more open woodland, shrublands, and steppe-like vegetation. Fossil leaves in late Eocene and Oligocene deposits show changes in size, shape, and margin type, consistent with cooler, more seasonal climates, and the disappearance of palms and other warmth-sensitive plants from some high-latitude sites marks the retreat of the most pronounced greenhouse conditions. Grasses present in earlier Paleogene ecosystems as minor components in specific habitats begin to expand in some regions as open ground becomes more common. At first, grass-dominated areas are patchy, mixed with shrubs and scattered trees in savanna like mosaics, rather than forming continuous grasslands. However, their spread along river terraces, upland plains, and seasonally dry regions foreshadows the later development of extensive grassland biomes. In these more open habitats, fire becomes a more frequent process, where dry seasons allow vegetation to cure and lightning ignites surface fuels. Fire clears woody plants in some areas, favouring grasses and other herbaceous species that can regrow quickly from protected buds or underground structures. Over time, feedbacks among climate fire and vegetation reinforce the presence of these open systems in certain parts of the continents. Sea level responds to both climatic and tectonic changes. As polar ice accumulates, global sea level falls relative to the earlier Eocene highs, and shallow epicontinental seas that once flooded continental interiors retreat. Coastal plains widen in some regions as former seafloors emerge, and deltas and estuaries adjust to new base levels. Marine sediments that once formed in shallow warm waters give way in places to river and coastal deposits laid down on newly exposed land. This shift reduces the area of some coastal wetlands and shallow marine habitats that previously supported rich communities of mollusks, fish, and Archaeocete whales. For marine mammals such as Basilosaurus and Dorudon, which are adapted to broad warm shelves and epicontinental seas, these changes in habitat and in the structure of marine food webs likely contribute to their decline toward the end of the Eocene. New cetacean groups with different feeding and sensory strategies begin to appear better suited to cooler waters and altered productivity patterns, but the focus here remains on the environments rather than their successors. On land, the contraction of some dense forests and the emergence of more open terrains influence mammal communities that have developed under greenhouse conditions. Forest-adapted forms that depend on closed canopies and stable, warm, humid microclimates, including some primates, early perissodactyls and semi-arboreal or understory specialists, find their ranges reduced in regions where forests break into patches or give way to more seasonal woodlands. Some lineages retreat to refuges along major rivers, coastal zones, or mountain slopes where moisture and tree cover remain more constant, while others adapt by shifting diets or locomotor behavior to tolerate more open seasonal habitats. In these changing landscapes, mammals with more cursorial body plans, longer limbs, and more energy-efficient gaits gain advantages. Entelodonts, early ruminants, and various perissodactyls with elongated limbs and well-developed hooves can travel longer distances between food and water sources in patchy environments. Large browsers such as Paraceratherium move across open woodlands and floodplains using their great height and reach to feed from scattered tall shrubs and trees. Smaller herbivores and omnivores that combine agility with endurance make use of both open ground and clumps of vegetation, shifting their foraging patterns with seasonal changes in plant growth. Teeth in many mammal lineages show corresponding trends. In increasingly seasonal and open settings, animals encounter more dust and grit on low vegetation and soils, and some begin to feed more heavily on grasses which contain abrasive silica bodies. To cope with higher rates of tooth wear, certain herbivores evolve higher crowned molars with thicker enamel and more complex patterns that can withstand prolonged grinding. In the Paleogene, this trend is in its earlier stages, with some groups showing modest increases in crown height and changes in enamel folding. The full development of very high-crowned true grazing dentitions comes later, but the initial steps are already present as cooling and openness advance. Predator communities also adjust to the shifting habitats. Large carnivores and omnivores such as entelodonts, early carnivorans and other lineages follow herbivore prey into more open environments. Their limbs and joint structures favour steady locomotion, and in some species short bursts of speed over relatively firm ground, contrasting with the more forest-bound, ambush-oriented strategies of some earlier Eocene predators. Open woodlands and shrublands reduce cover for stalking, but allow longer sight distances, favouring different hunting tactics, including pursuit over moderate distances and scavenging over broader home ranges. The arrangement of river systems and basins is influenced by both tectonics and climate. In some areas, uplift creates new plateaus and mountain ranges that modify atmospheric circulation, producing rain shadows and further encouraging the development of drier, more open habitats on leeward sides. In others, subsidence forms internal basins where lakes accumulate and store sediments that record the surrounding vegetation and animal life. Late Paleogene lake beds in certain regions show alternations between phases dominated by forest pollen and those with more grass and shrub pollen, indicating climatic fluctuations on timescales longer than human lifespans but shorter than the entire epoch. These shifts suggest that the transition from greenhouse to cooler conditions is not a simple linear change, but involves pulses of cooling and relative warming, with ecosystems responding in complex ways. High-latitude regions show some of the most marked transformations. Where Eocene forests once grew under long summer days and mild winters, cooler temperatures and increasing seasonality lead to the decline of warmth-loving trees. In some areas, forests remain but become more boreal in character, with conifers and cold-tolerant deciduous species predominating. In others, especially where land and sea configurations promote strong cooling forests retreat and are replaced by more open tundra like vegetation, paving the way for later more extensive ice cover. These changes affect not only local plant and animal communities, but also the global climate system, as shifts in surface reflectivity and carbon storage feed back into temperature and atmospheric composition. By the end of the Paleogene, the combined effects of lower carbon dioxide levels, polar ice growth, altered ocean circulation, and reorganized vegetation produce a world that differs significantly from the early Eocene greenhouse state. Sea levels are lower, climatic gradients are sharper, and open habitats occupy larger areas on many continents. Tropical and subtropical forests persist but are more restricted, while temperate forests, woodlands, shrublands, and early grass-rich systems expand in various configurations. Mammal faunas reflect this new context, with a mix of survivors from older lineages and new forms adapted to cooler, more seasonal, and more open environments. Within the structured narrative of the Paleogene, this late-stage cooling and habitat shift forms one of the innermost environmental layers, setting the background against which the surviving mammal and bird groups continue their diversification into the Neogene world that follows. In the closing stages of the Paleogene, cooler climates, altered sea levels, and changing vegetation produce continental and marine ecosystems that differ from those of the early Eocene, yet many animal and plant lineages that first diversify in the warm greenhouse world continue to occupy the reshaped habitats. On land, broad belts of temperate forest, woodland, and shrubland cover much of the middle latitudes, while tropical and subtropical forests persist in equatorial regions and in coastal and riverine refuges. Open grass-rich areas appear in some interiors and on rain-shadow plains mixed with shrubs and scattered trees. These mosaics offer a variety of niches defined by differences in shade, moisture, and plant structure, and animals that are able to use several of these niches gain an advantage as climates fluctuate on timescales longer than individual lifespans but shorter than the span of the period. The large epicontinental seas of earlier times have mostly withdrawn as polar ice grows and sea level falls, leaving behind wider coastal plains cut by rivers and estuaries. Along these coasts, salt marshes, tidal flats, and barrier systems support communities of shorebirds, small mammals, and invertebrates adapted to brackish conditions. Inland river systems adjust to new gradients, carving deeper valleys in some regions and building thick alluvial deposits in others. Lakes form in tectonic basins, and subsiding areas their sediments preserving pollen dust and the remains of organisms transported from surrounding uplands. Within this physical framework, mammal faunas show a mixture of long-established Paleogene groups and more recently emerged lineages. Perissodactyl herbivores such as horses, rhinoceroses, and their extinct relatives remain important in many regions. Late Paleogene horses are generally larger and longer-legged than their Eocene ancestors, with more specialized teeth that show increasing adaptation to diets that may include more abrasive plants. Some still browse mainly on leaves in wooded habitats, while others exploit more open grass-influenced vegetation. Rhinoceratids and related forms occupy roles as medium to large browsers and mixed feeders in forest edges, and more open country their robust bodies and strong limbs suited to moving through varied terrain. At the same time, artiodactyls, the even-toed hoofed mammals, grow in diversity and ecological range. Early ruminants, relatives of deer, antelope, and cattle lines, appear in late Paleogene deposits, with skeletal features that imply complex stomachs and efficient fermentation. These animals tend to have relatively light builds, elongated legs and teeth that show traits useful for processing fibrous plant material, allowing them to succeed in both wooded and more open habitats. Other artiodactyl groups, including early relatives of pigs and hippopotamuses, occupy more omnivorous or semi-aquatic niches, feeding on mixed plant and animal matter in forests, wetlands, and river margins. Rodents and lagomorphs expand markedly in both richness and abundance. Their small body sizes, rapid reproduction, and diverse tooth forms allow them to exploit seeds, root stems, and invertebrates across many habitats. Fossil rodent teeth are common in Oligocene sediments from Europe, Asia, and North America, indicating that they become key components of many ecosystems. Some species burrow in open ground, helping to aerate soils and influence sediment structure, while others live in forests or along waterways. Bats already present earlier in the Paleogene continue to diversify in the air. Their wing bones and skulls in late Paleogene deposits show a range of sizes and feeding strategies from insect eating to fruit feeding. Together with birds, they occupy aerial insectivore and pollinator roles that link plant and animal communities across vertical layers of vegetation. Primates, though constrained by climatic cooling and habitat change in some regions, persist in suitable environments. In low-latitude forests and in certain subtropical areas, small to medium-sized primates with grasping hands and feet and forward-facing eyes move through trees feeding on fruits, leaves, and insects. Their fossils, including jaws, teeth, and occasional limb bones, indicate multiple lineages in parts of Africa and Asia. Within the Paleogene, they represent arboreal or semi-arboreal components of forest and woodland communities that depend on continuous or at least connected tree cover. Carnivorous mammals also show important changes. Early true carnivorans diversify in the late Paleogene, alongside older predatory and omnivorous lineages. Their skulls and teeth show specialized carnassial pairs, the shearing premolar and molar teeth that slice flesh efficiently. Some carnivorans are small hunting rodents, insects, and other small vertebrates in forests and open areas, while others grow larger and feed on ungulates or scavenge carcasses. Entelodonts, with their massive skulls and mixed diet, remain prominent in some Oligocene faunas, especially in open woodlands and floodplains where they can travel widely. The combined presence of specialized carnivorans and large omnivores produces predator guilds in which different species target different prey sizes, use different hunting strategies, or rely more heavily on scavenging. Birds adapt to the cooler and more varied climates by occupying roles in both forests and open country. Large flightless forms like Gastornis are gone by the later Paleogene, but other birds with strong flight capabilities thrive. Waterfowl use lakes and rivers, waders feed on invertebrates in wetlands and along shores, and raptors hunt small mammals and other birds in many habitats. Perching birds diversify especially in wooded regions where their varied beaks and feeding behaviors allow them to exploit seeds, insects, and fruits. In the oceans, fully aquatic whales that appear in the late Eocene continue to evolve and diversify. Archaeocete forms such as Basilosaurus and Dorudon decline, while early representatives of later baleen-bearing and toothed whale branches emerge in cooler, more structured seas. Marine ecosystems in the late Paleogene also include pinniped-like mammals along some coasts, large predatory sharks, and rich fish faunas. Plankton communities adjust to cooler surface waters and altered nutrient regimes as ocean circulation reorganizes, but primary production remains high in upwelling zones and along some continental margins. Across both land and sea, the late Paleogene biosphere consists of networks of species that include both old lineages and newer taxa. Many of the basic ecological roles already present earlier in the period are now filled by combinations of mammals and birds that fit the cooler, more seasonal climates and the more open, varied vegetation. Climate cooling changing sea level and the spread of grass-influenced habitats reshape the distribution and composition of communities, compared with the early Paleogene, but within the closing interval of the period they function as coherent systems with food webs and physical environments closely matched to one another on each continent and in each ocean basin.